My name is Adam Tomasi with Champion Briefs, and this is the topic analysis for the September-October 2018 LD Resolution, which is resolved in the United States. Reporters ought to have the right to protect the confidentiality of their sources. So I helped out with the brief for this topic from Champion Briefs, and I really encourage you to check it out because it has a lot of really helpful evidence on both sides. And all of us at Champion Briefs have really tried to tackle every aspect and angle of the topic, everything from a democracy app to a sports disad, for how you can engage this topic in a variety of ways. So I really encourage you to find that ASAP as a starting point for your research. So I'm going to also approach the topic from multiple angles in order to make your debates insightful, interesting, and above all strategic. I think that there are 4 affirmative positions that this lecture is going to be centered on, and we'll talk about the negative positions in the context of each, because you always want your negative positions to be contextual to the affirmative. Of course, these could also be negatives too. So first is the set of democracy cases revolving around the questions of freedom of the press. So, for example, Laura Handman, in an article titled "Protection of Confidential Sources, a Moral, Legal, and Civic Duty," argues that the First Amendment requires the protection of reporters' privilege to protect the confidentiality of their sources, and subsequently that freedom of the press would be undermined without a shield law, meaning that reporters need to have the right to protect the anonymity of the people that have trusted them with secret information so that there wouldn't be what she calls a chilling effect. And this is a phrase that a lot of authors use, that there wouldn't be a deterrent or a disincentive for people to come out with sensitive information because they know that their identities will be forcibly divulged by a subpoena. So if the reporter or the company they work for, say the New York Times, gets sued for leaking sensitive classified info about our drone program, for instance, or NSA surveillance. So that gets at the heart of democratic accountability and checks on government. This also ties into a question of whistleblowers. So Handman gives a variety of examples where confidential sources were necessary to hold both governments and corporations accountable. So the Pentagon Papers, where towards the end of the Vietnam War, Daniel Ellsberg had released, I was trying to remember his name, Daniel Ellsberg had released to the New York Times and the Washington Post a set of really important papers from the Pentagon's secret history of the Vietnam War, where they acknowledged that multiple presidents from Kennedy, Johnson onward knew that it was a losing battle. So it essentially delegitimized the war effort for good reason, because it showed that the Vietnam War was understood to be a lost cause from the beginning, and that the government lied by saying that we were winning. She also gives examples of Watergate, the secret info that had implicated Nixon in the break-in at the Watergate Motel, the secret torture and abuse happening at the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. Then you have the case of Enron fraud, where Enron had lied to its investors and secret information from a confidential source was necessary to unearth that. And then also a variety of examples of fraud from tobacco companies, fertility clinics, etc. So you can definitely expand the scope of your argument to talk about all sorts of abuses of power, or you can narrow it down to corporations, just to government, etc. You could even write an affirmative that's all about surveillance, let's say, or torture. And then why confidential sources are necessary in that regard. So that could be part of a democracy case, but I do think that these examples lend their way into a util debate. So you'd have an affirmative that says that there's some really large impact to government abuses of power. Let's say unchecked NSA surveillance is hindering our ability to effectively deal with terrorism, or it's violating privacy rights and making the US look less credible on rights issues. The affirmative could argue then that it would improve our international standing for there to be more whistleblowers like future Edward Snowdens in order to take advantage of confidentiality and the rights that that brings for reporters to unearth this information so that the government gets its act together. On the negative, on the other hand, you could take advantage of this whistleblowing debate to argue that these leaks would compromise national security, So, for example, Randall Eliason argues in U.S. News and World Report that there could be a hypothetical scenario where a confidential source leaks that our nuclear energy facilities are unsecure in particular ways, and that the government has failed to keep them safe from potential terrorist attacks. And then terrorists could potentially take advantage of that info that's been divulged and then stage an attack. Of course, in the article, he claims in his hypothetical that the attack is foiled at the last minute, but he does think that there's a security risk there to these kinds of leaks. So you could argue that information needs to remain classified for the sake of overall well-being, whereas the affirmative could say, on the other hand, that there need to be leaks to hold government accountable and give the public more knowledge that they can then use to improve upon society, which definitely has similar justifications to the democracy contention. It is an iteration of the free press. But at the same time, it's a different framework because the emphasis becomes less on what are our fundamental rights under the Constitution and instead what would lead to the greatest output of happiness over suffering, like how many lives do we save and so on. The third set of affirmatives would come down to a set of Kantian positions, whether one that says that reporters have an obligation to follow their promises, and that they can't turn back on a promise of confidentiality, even if there are legal consequences to maintaining that promise, because it would be immoral for them to go against a commitment that they made to their sources. So, for example, David Shaw in the Los Angeles Times in 2003, in an article titled "Promises of Confidentiality Aren't Made to Be Broken," argued that a reporter's word is their bond, so it's absolute, inviolable, and so on. Insert various Kantian language here, the categorical imperative suggesting that any form of promise breaking could not be universalized, since if we envisioned a world where everybody decided not to keep their promises, then that would undermine the basis for trust in a society and for free human action, respect, and so on. You could also argue the reverse, that reporters have an obligation to be honest, and that truth-telling is also an essential moral duty that cannot be violated, and that a protection of confidentiality for reporters would encourage people to give fake or misleading information under the cover of anonymity, like personal attacks, or Michael Foley, for example, in his critique of confidentiality, refers to rich and powerful spin doctors manipulating the news under the cover of an anonymous source as their placeholder for who they really are when they give this information. And Edward Wasserman, in a critique of source confidentiality, argues that not only would a protection of a reporter's privilege do this, but it would also mean that they would be encouraging people who, let's say, have made a contract with the government that they wouldn't disclose sensitive information, would then be encouraging them to break their promise. So confidentiality then becoming a vehicle for promise breaking instead of promise keeping. So that's another aspect of the debate you can think about, the questions of inviolable rights and duties. The fourth category of cases that's worth noting is the virtue ethics-based positions that have to do with professional ethics and the virtues of journalism. So you could argue that ethics and the focus of the framework debate should be contextual to the roles that each person has. So we can't just talk about morality in the abstract on this topic, we have to talk about the particular obligations that reporters have. So whether reporters have an obligation to be transparent with the public, and confidentiality may undermine that, or reporters have an obligation to be a watchdog for the people, which means that they have the ethical and civic duty to give whistleblowers an opportunity to feel comfortable giving out important information so that the press can perform its vital duty of being a check on government abuses of power and stuff that gets kept secret and then fails to be transparent to the public. So that also intersects with the democracy component too. However, the debate here would really be about what the role of a journalist is and what their unique expectations are. So you could argue that your opponent's value and value criterion are not applicable enough to the unique circumstances at hand. And these cases in this fourth category might actually be the most interesting because they really get to the heart of journalistic ethics and professional codes. Keep in mind too that a lot of professional codes for news companies like the New York Times, for example, do encourage reporters to protect the confidentiality of their sources in most cases. Others, I believe it might be NPR, for example, say that they try to stray away from using confidential sources whenever possible, but there are certain exceptions. So that debate can maybe get a little messy of like, what do these news companies actually say are their professional codes? So it might be better to get instead into the debate about whistleblowing versus fake news. So I wanted to clarify finally some aspects of the resolutional mechanism. So keep in mind that the resolution has no actor. It does not say the United States federal government should protect a reporter's privilege to maintain the confidentiality of their sources. Instead, it states a general principle that reporters ought to have this right. Of course, when you're the affirmative, you can argue that this right is a legal one, and that a reporter's right to maintain confidentiality needs legal protection. So, for example, Amanda Konarski in The Reporter's Privilege is Essential, the Checks and Balances Being Accessible to the American Electorate, long title I know, argues that even though 49 states and the District of Columbia have some iteration of a reporter's privilege or a shield law, which is the term of art for the law that protects reporters' right to maintain confidentiality against a court order to divulge that information, that you need the Supreme Court to step in and say that there is a universal right among all reporters in the U.S. to that confidentiality, because lots of federal courts, the circuit courts, are split on whether a reporter's privilege is guaranteed or not, and that legal confusion can be an opportunity for the Supreme Court to address its maybe ill-advised decision in 1972 in the case called Brandsburg versus Hayes, which Laura Handman expounds on and argues that 4 justices there held that there was no guaranteed reporter's privilege in the Constitution. But at the same time, Justice Lewis Powell, in what's called a concurring opinion, so it's an addendum to the majority opinion that maybe diverges a little bit, argues that there should be a balancing test between the imperatives of freedom of the press and dealing with criminal conduct. So whistleblowers having broken the law, like classified information that should have remained classified. Maybe an anonymous source had revealed a tip for who committed a crime, and law enforcement would like to know who that person is, but the reporter will not divulge that information. So that's what Powell's talking about with the balancing test. Of course, you could argue from that balancing test perspective that there ought not be an absolute right to confidentiality because we need to account for competing considerations under the law. But at the same time, as the affirmative, you could say that this general principle of a reporter's privilege does allow for certain exceptions, and that the affirmative doesn't have to say that all reporters all the time can protect any sources on any issue. That the affirmative can say that, reasonably speaking, we should be able to make distinctions. On that note, I would also like to suggest that the affirmative could say that they don't have to engage in this debate about what the government should do. They could say instead that it's about the ideal of a reporter's shield law. But by the same token, when there are affirmatives that do read a plan, let's say, that the negative has a lot of avenues. So they get the political capital DA about how a shield law would implicate other items on Trump or Congress's agenda, the federalism DA about what it means for the federal government to establish a uniform standard when shield laws have traditionally been a state-by-state issue, and how that can affect other examples of state innovation and how they relate to the federal government. There's even the state's counterplan. Well, for example, you could argue that the states ought to all come together and create a uniform standard for their shield laws, because they're all different in some respects. So you could say that that achieves the same goals of the affirmative without operating at a federal level. But the affirmative can certainly contest whether that's a legitimate negative avenue. One last comment I'll make for the mechanics of the topic is about what is a reporter. So Ronnell Anderson Jones argues that an anonymous speech right, which protects the speaker of the anonymous info instead of the reporter, is better because it avoids that vague question of what a reporter means, and that the law could never accommodate all the changes in technology that expand what journalism is supposed to mean. Whereas Stephanie Turner, on the other hand, in Protecting Citizen Journalists, Why Congress Should Adopt a Broad Federal Shield Law, argues that the federal government should follow from the example of California and New Jersey, where they define reporters to mean anybody who disseminates the news on any platform for the sake of public interest, rather than a very narrow definition that's also been proposed by some in Congress, like current Vice President Pence in the Free Flow of Information Act of '05, which only protected those whose livelihood is reporting or who work for an established media company. So if the negative says it's unclear what a reporter means and that that's a dilemma for a shield law, the affirmative could clarify that they follow the examples of California and New Jersey and protect all citizen journalists. So in short, this topic gives you a lot of really diverse avenues for addressing the questions of democracy, national security, law enforcement, and the Constitution with a variety of ethical frameworks. And I really hope you have a great series of debates on the 2 months you'll have on this topic. And with that being said, this is Adam Tomasi from Champion Briefs. Check out our evidence brief for this topic because me and a lot of the other brief writers have really dived into all of the nuances of the topic, which I've tried my best to encapsulate here. And it's a pretty good product, so I encourage you to check that out. Thank you so much.